crossroads. And as a crossroads, we get used by archaeologists, historians, linguists, philologists, but in a way, everyone is applying a different lens to epigraphy. And you can see this in Routledge's new handbook to cognitive theory in the classics. It has 24 chapters with 6 different sections, and not one of them is actually an epigraphy section. Epigraphy is used in some of the things, but sometimes as a crossroads, we can kind of get left out a bit. So I'm hoping to kind of start a new niche and a new discussion with what we're looking at today. So if I can just move my slide here. For those of you who don't necessarily have that much experience with epigraphy, it covers anything that's been written on. And as such, we kind of cover a broad swathe of materials, but it's also quite, it can be quite image-based. The inscriptions also have their own kind of constraints. We have writing in different contexts with different functions and parameters, which also can develop its own language. And as a result, some of the features of inscriptions are not dissimilar to what we find in modern social media, where we have controlled platforms and limitations on expression, how much you can say, the space in which you can say it. The evolving speech can also be quite formulaic. And what we also have is that kind of lovely claim of personal success and achievement, which may not have actually existed in reality, as well as typos that can't be easily corrected. So in a way, it has interesting parallels in that when we have a different context for communication, that can create a different lens and a different format and presentation of communication. And I think that different context of epigraphy is actually quite important. So when we come to reading monuments, this is the first place where context really strikes us. If you read texts in books, your first experience trying to read a monument can be quite shocking, if not in my case, humiliating. I had to present the Arch of Septimius Severus for my classmates who didn't know Latin, and I had read the dedication of the arch, kind of on as a published test. It looks fairly straightforward, but when I was there in the blazing heat staring in front of it, it was very hard to see the letters, and even more difficult to read it without knowing what all the abbreviations were. And there are bustling tour guides going hither and yon, and actually you don't necessarily need to know a lot of Roman history to see this giant arch in front of the Senate House with a bunch of kind of captured figures on it to understand that Septimius Severus is conveying military victory right in the face of the Roman Senate. So it really made me think context is incredibly important for these. And what if there are other ways of reading these monuments that don't necessarily involve a primary engagement with a reading of the text? So in this particular discussion, the structure is going to be an introduction to cognitive approaches. So basically kind of how we understand the world around us. And then part 2, we're going to look at reading so these are actually in the wrong order. Part 1 is reading bilingualism, and part 2 is reading erasures. And we're going to take some of the ideas from the cognitive discussions and then apply them to how we view inscriptions. So that's at least my plan. Hopefully that works. As an introduction to cognitive theory, so there were 3 main branches of cognitive theory that inspired me. The first was the cognitive science of religion, which provides us with a kind of ground-up model for deconstructing a lived experience. So it's very important in terms of being able to say we have similar pathways and functions in terms of our cognitive processes, so we can actually use some of our criterion from lived experience of the present in the past, and kind of connecting that brain with its encultured experiences. So in terms of cognitive neuroscience, this also gave me a framework to understand exactly how we read and what the physical constraints are in that process, and also to recognize how monuments actually, whether or not they understood the limitations of cognition, they actually compensate for them in some way. And finally, another inspiration for me was kind of cognitive approaches to archaeology, particularly material engagement theory, which allows us to consider kind of sensory approaches and agency with objects. So all of these combined provide us with some important new ways of looking at inscriptions. So one of the most recent things I've done in this lovely book with Blanca on senses and cognition is look at cognitive theories. Now, the language of cognition can somewhat be a bit challenging and cumbersome. And if I'm honest, I still don't know if I fully understand what distributed cognition is. I read it, I try to understand, but when you try to explain it to someone else, there are lots of kind of complicated mechanisms going on. So one thing that's fantastic about cognition is that it's something that has a basis in lived experience. So there are examples and illustrations that you can give to someone that often demonstrate the cognitive limitations you're talking about. And there will be plenty of those in this talk. They also represent kind of similar neural pathways that connect all of us. So it's also one of the most useful ways to employ and use cognition. And my co-edited volume with Blanca has a lot of case studies where we do exactly that. And in the introduction, we kind of try to explain what these theories are and make them accessible, because part of the accessibility issue with cognitive theories can be the languages that we use. And the cognitive science of religion in particular has this ground up process of building an experience that also allows us to include a neurodiverse audience. And this doesn't necessarily only need to apply to rituals. Ancient monuments are in public places. They're meant to be seen by people. And I think this idea that if you couldn't read, you were kind of blind to the written words, particularly in a monumental landscape, I'm not sure it necessarily works as a theory. And kind of for a more detailed example, my chapter in this called "Nobody's Gonna Rain on My Parade" is actually an attempt to take a large inscription as a script and turn it into a reality, turn it into a lived experience, to consider what actually happens when we take a script, and again, that aspirational concept of something, and turn it into a reality. And the answer is plenty of surprises. So this picture down at the bottom is actually me last week at a teacher training session with Emma Jane Graham and Esther Idaho, trying to recreate some ritual experiences for teachers. Because again, cognition isn't just something that we apply in our research, but it's also crucial to teaching and engaging a larger audience of neurodiverse students, and also just engaging people on different levels with material evidence. So I think it's also key to kind of stepping back or stepping in front of barriers of literacy. So in terms of cognitive neuroscience and perception, I wanted to go through a few basic background things about how we read, which general people might not be aware of. The first of which is that there isn't an intelligent design to our brain that allows us to read, even though some people kind of subscribe to that theory. The process is only about 5,000 years old, and it evolved by co-opting existing neural pathways for reading a visual landscape. So when you're looking at monuments, that's an incredibly important connection, that reading is actually part of or a segment of reading a visual landscape. And that innate connection, I think, is very powerful. So how does reading actually happen? In a nutshell, we recognize words through a small area on the retina called the fovea. and it's only about 15% of the visual field. So you have to catch it at just the right angle. And it also, when you look through your left eye, you see the right side. And when you look through your right eye, you see the left side. So the region in the brain that kind of decodes and recognizes letters, cognitive neuroscientists call it the letter box, is in the left hemisphere. So what you see on your right hand side goes directly through your left eye into the left hemisphere. But what you see on the right side, on your left hand side of a text, goes through your right eye and then has to travel across to the letter box. So that's one weakness in the process. And it also means that the left side of our vision and our reading needs the most help, which is kind of fascinating when you think the auto setting of Microsoft Word documents is a left-hand margin. And the left-hand margin to this day is a key facet that needs to be clear in order for us to read. Another process that we learn with cognition is that the eye doesn't go straight across, but it scans. It skips in little groups of 5 to 7 letters. And so the scanning eye isn't always perfect either. And what it really needs are things like spaces and stops between words. It needs a break, and it only has a scan that's a certain size, and it can make adjustments, but those adjustments take time. So lack of space can be a fundamental issue, and variation in letter size can add time. But in the first kind of quarter of a second, when we look at something, everyone's experience is the same. That first judge a book by its cover moment is the same for everyone. And it's only when things get to the letterbox region of the brain that reading starts to break down into kind of words. But there are numerous ways to recognize words, and the letterbox region is close to a bunch of other regions and has strong associations with things like facial recognition, shape recognition, symbolic recognition. And so these are all important parts. And once we recognize a word, we can then kind of code that word in a number of different ways, either by phonetic, by symbolic, or by word recognition. But these use many different areas of the brain at the same time. So if you've ever lost track of time when you're reading, that's because it requires so much wattage to read that you can even disconnect from your internal clock. Now, there are faster routes for recognition. So if you notice that the longer we read, the better we get at it. And part of that is because our brain offloads difficult things like word recognition through different pathways like symbolic recognition. So you're not actually reading a whole word, but you're recognizing a pattern, almost like a predictive text algorithm. Our brains are kind of predicting what's going to happen. So it's a complex process that takes a lot of wattage, and visual framework and context play a major role in it. And just to show you how easily we can get thrown, this picture at the side of the slide here is a joke image that was kind of one of Charles Dickens' The Puzzle. And if you look at it and you're a trained epigrapher or someone who's just trained in looking at kind of monuments, you will find it very hard to read. What are these abbreviations? They don't make any sense. You will literally be stumped. However, if you just disregard all of those things and just read the letters, it says, beneath this stone, see, even I am having trouble here. Uh, beneath this stone lies reposit Claude, Claude Costa, who, and you see TRIP looks like a common Roman abbreviation, trib, but it actually tells you that this guy was a tripe seller. So the framework that we have is very specific and it's very learned. And when we try and step out of it, it can be very difficult. So another action in reading is the perceptive process, where we try to make sense of the world around us. And on one level, it's very important. But on another, it also shows that there's a complex process going on here. So when you look at these pictures, the first two images here of the statue and of Donald Trump and his Death Star, are obviously manipulated, and they went viral. And the question is why they went viral on the internet. And the answer is because they target in the brain an error prediction code. So the brain goes, whoa, whoa, what is this? I wasn't expecting this. And that triggers the attention and the engagement that we need to learn. And so, I mean, one of the problems, though, is in a way, the more we see, the better we become at predicting the world. But this can also lead to cognitive bias, where our expectations of what should happen can override what's actually happening. And I can demonstrate this with this last set of signs here that say "to let." When I first arrived in the UK and I looked out the cab window, I saw a bunch of "to let" signs, and I thought they were signs for toilets. And I was like, why are there all these toilets everywhere? And the answer was that these weren't those kind of signs at all. But my brain looked around, they're like buildings, big signs, starts with a T, ends with a T, there's an L in the middle. It must say toilet. And Jeremy Swist, the metal classicist, had recorded a similar experience. And actually, this happens to a number of people when we try and make sense of the world around us. But what fascinated me about this experience is that I actually we treat reading as a primary experience, as the primary thing that we do. But my reading of the landscape, of the imagery, of the lettering, of what the sign actually said, overrode what the text said. I actually imagined a letter that wasn't there in an effort to make sense. So it shows you just how powerful that perception process is. And also how when something doesn't meet our expectations, it excites it, it compels us. And this is really important because for rituals and for things like monuments, which are kind of repetitive and everywhere, if that repetition continues unchanged, then it can become invisible to us or boring. We don't see it. But if it changes, and that it doing something we don't expect to do is exactly what triggers attention and engagement. So in terms of understanding what happens on the monumental landscape, this is an important part of the perceptive process. So context of reading, if we look at so we read in different places. Obviously, when knowing the constraints of reading, people go to their local library, a place where you can sit down, where there's light, where there's quiet, where there's no distracting. But in the monumental context, we don't have that. In fact, in addition, we have a whole bunch of difficulties that are thrown at us. If we're walking on a street, in order to walk forward, you have to keep a forward perspective. You have to look forward, which I found out the hard way when I was on a treadmill on a cruise ship in Norway, and I decided to look to the side at the beautiful fjords we were passing, and I got thrown off the treadmill. So where we are when we read impacts that process. And it's a main feature that divides ancient viewers from modern ones. So to take us into our modern perspective, here's a basic source book entry. It's from the Lactor, and it presents 3 different sources to us as a written text. So how do you experience this reading? How do you imagine these sources? We look at them, we sit down, we read them as a book, and reading is the kind of primary thing. And it's implied that literacy is the only way to engage with these. And we see that even in the format of the text. So if you look, with the first arrow, the text comes first. Then in smaller letters, we get the source, which tells us what kind of an inscription is. Is it a literary passage, what it is? And then in even smaller letters at the bottom is the context, if we even get it, of where this inscription was. There's no sense of kind of physical or sensory engagement. And in reality, this is a complete inversion of the experience of ancient readers, where sitting down with a papyrus in your hand in a library was fundamentally different from walking up to a monumental gate in Ostia, or confronting an Ostian official who was wearing this badge on his chest. So how do we get that experience into things? Another bias that we have when we look at text and we look at text, we lose the ability to imagine what a text looks like. So here's a beautiful text from RIB. RIB is a fantastic website that gives you context. It gives you geolocators. It gives you commentary. It gives you drawings. It gives you all the pieces that you need. But if we just look at the text, no one would imagine this as an outcome. The ordinatio on this is a hot mess. And even if you could read, a lot of these abbreviations aren't conventional. And what you can see also in this inscription is the fundamental difference between the left side, the left-hand side of the text, which is aspirational. Everyone starts it out, oh, look, we're going to keep a beautiful ordination. And the right side, where they're trying to squeeze all the letters in at the end and don't necessarily make it. So by losing this connection, we also lose our ability to understand how inscriptions were different, how they could engage readers by errors, by mistakes, by differences in presentation. And that, I think, is a fundamental disconnect. We also lose a sense of the constraints of how fragmentary an inscription is, or how difficult it was for the carver to place. So what I've tried to do with my methodology in these case studies is actually take us through a monument, is to reinvert that process. So what would happen if we applied a different lens to looking at inscriptions? What if we looked at the historical, emotional, archaeological context first, then we looked at the appearance of writing in a picture, and then we looked at the text? Would changing that change the way that we see inscriptions? Would it, at the very least, allow us to realize, recognize, and compensate as individuals for the differences between reading texts in books and experiencing monuments? What this also allows us to do, really, is to consider the way a broader audience of individuals engaged with these. People with no literacy, people with adversities reading, people who were just walking past. And that is more at one with the public context in which these are placed. So questions we're going to ask, the first case study is reading bilingualism at Ephesus. And questions we're going to ask are bilingual monuments, primarily state voices? Because one of the products that we have in this equation is actually that when we look at texts in books, we focus on reading. And bilingualism is also often read as the language of imperial power and mandate. Broader studies like Rosamund Kersley's studies of bilingualism Asia Minor that look at a broader corpus have actually said, it's probably not just an imperial voice. We need to look more closely at this. But it is one problem, and what we don't realize is that our book text-based mentality also leads us to a text-based supremacy and top-down, trickle-down models of how we view the ancient world. Well, if you had to be literate, then all these messages are obviously only coming from elites, and only elites are being engaged and participating in this process. So do these only represent elite voices? And then the way that we present writing is often in a uniform, standardized format and written text, which completely makes sense and makes them more accessible, but again, also shifts our own expectations as readers, what these are supposed to look like. So the question is, in reality, do the messages look similar? Are letter sizes the same? How do we represent two different languages? And is bilingualism a static phenomenon that always looks the same? Or is it something that can vary in time and in place? So our first case study is Augustus's Parabolos wall. And I just want to provide a bit of context for this. So the wall gets set up in about 5 to 6 BC. But in the city of Ephesus, Augustus, just historical, emotional context, Ephesus sided with Mark Antony. So when Augustus comes in, he doesn't necessarily tread very lightly. And one of the things he has to do is actually decrease the asylum boundaries of the Artemision. And by decreasing the asylum boundaries, he's also decreasing revenues. So this is not a popular decision. And then what he does is he uses the Artemision revenues for his own projects, which include the wall around the Augustea, or sorry, the wall around the Artemision, but it also includes an Augusteum, roadworks, etc. So this wasn't necessarily 100% popular move that he was making, and the context was slightly charged. The drawing here shows you exactly where these inscriptions were in the wall. So there are actually two, and we're looking at the A and C texts, two bilingual texts, and they're on either side. So these are two kind of corners of a wall. So they're on either side of the wall outside the parabolos. So not in a main kind of viewing context, but still marking out a sacred space. So in terms of representing bilingualism, let's look at what it actually looks like. I mean, this inscription here, the Latin letters are huge. They're more than twice the size of the Greek letters. They also stand out more because there's spaces between them, which facilitate the reading eye. There are stop marks, which facilitate the reading eye. There's indentation on the bottom line. Now, compare just the visual framework of that to the representation of the Greek, which is smaller. It's in a lower register. And if you look on the top text, there's kind of a hole between the S and the T. They've been carved around that hole. That is a damaged piece of stone that they just put the Greek text on and carved around. So in a way, the Greek text is kind of subjugated to the Latin text. And it's hard to think that as a Greek viewer, you looked at this and felt empowered. So that's kind of one issue. We're going to talk about the erasures a little bit later. But this is what the monumental text you would see looks like. There's no difference between the letter sizes. You don't really see the spacing. You don't see difficulties in the carving process. There's so much that you don't see. And when I actually looked at these inscriptions for the first time, because I've been taught, oh, Augustus is great politician and diplomat, I actually thought, oh, wow, this is a nice diplomatic way of kind of breaking the ice. But it isn't. And so in this respect, there is a very clear kind of Roman mandate for what is going on. Now, other projects that are happening at the same time, the other main benefactor at this time is a Roman citizen and friend of Augustus. So local Ephesian institutions not playing a big role at this point. And Gaius Sextilius Pollio builds a brilliant aqueduct outside the city, and he also rebuilds this giant triple-aisled Basilica Stoa. It's labeled number 21 across the diagram. And on the sides of it are two gigantic bronze inscriptions that bear in mind, they're on the outside of the building. So you don't see them when you're walking inside the covered portico, but from the outside, you could see them. And they're absolutely spectacular. The Latin letters the blocks were 20 to 19 centimeters high with 10-centimeter letters and 2 to 3 holes to secure the letters. The Greek counterparts were about the size on the block was about 12 to 11 centimeters, and then the letters were 7 centimeters. So they were about 3 centimeters shorter, but more similar in height. And they had about 1 to 2 holes. But again, what you can see is, well, two important things. One, a fundamental disconnect between the appearance of the Latin with letters that are, again, clearly separated with interpuncts, that even a passing viewer looking quickly could catch 1 or 2 words, whereas comparatively, the Greek text does not have spaces. Now, it's important to note, the Greeks didn't have a tradition of putting a lot of spaces between their words. So this isn't kind of outside of the Greek tradition, but by juxtaposing the two languages on top of each other, it creates a visual juxtaposition where these two languages look not just like different alphabets, but fundamentally different forms of expression, where Latin is clearly playing a hierarchical role. And this is a very quick look. I'm not really going to go into the text much, except to say that there's no way someone would have viewed this entire text. It is 160 meters going across the building. The Latin text was at least 60 meters, and the Greek text was even longer than that. So these are incredibly long things that you would probably only see in bits and pieces. Again, not designed at all to be read in full, but to impress viewers with the magnificence, the control, the expense of bronze letters and Roman power. So we're going to flash forward to the Trajanic period. So this is the Trajanic embolos. This comes right off the State Agora, heading down towards the theater. It is a beautiful monumental space. And 100 years later, we have a new world of bilingualism. So it's not that there was no bilingualism between the time of Augustus and Trajan, but there are only a handful of Flavian examples. There was a bit under Nero, but it pretty much went out of fashion. And that might not be disconnected to the problematic way in which Augustus is presenting bilingualism in the urban landscape. So there's barely a handful in the Flavian period. In under the Trajanic period, you get over 24 bilingual inscriptions and 18 between the years of 103 and 108. So there is definitely a kind of new vogue coming in terms of the representation of bilingualism. And so this is a dedication. It's from the British Museum of Tiberius Claudius Secundus, who was an imperial freedman. So someone with imperial connections, and who held Roman offices, but the dedication is by the Gerousia, which is a local civic institution. So what we have is not something that is a direct mandate from Rome, but something that is being set out by a uniquely Roman institution. Now, what is fascinating to me about this monument is the extent to which there's been a shift in the representation of language. So yes, the top line is still bigger. These are about 5-centimeter letters. But as we go down, the next letters are about 3 centimeters high. And crucially, in the transition from Latin to Greek, the letter size is equivalent, if not the Greek letters are actually larger than the Latin letters on the bottom of the Latin line, which has the little red box with the honoris causa. What we also have are visual dynamics in the Greek text. You have a large upsilon letter, which draws attention to the role of the Gerousia, and the fact that formulaically there have been subtle changes, because in the Greek, we start with the benefactor, the person who is honoring someone, not the honorand. So what we see are two messages that say the same thing, but that accept the cultural nuances and the different traditions of writing. And even if you look at the letter forms, so you have an A, which is similar, but if you look at the A's in the Greek, they have an angulate tribar. Similarly, if you look at E's, it's technically the same letter, but the letter is serifed in a different way, and has a kind of shorter bit coming out of it. Even letters like M and N have subtle differences in the way that they're presented, because these are meant to look like two different languages, but their juxtaposition is much more balanced. Again, I'm giving you a small sample of the materials that are available. This is one of 3 bilingual bases that was in the Harbor Gymnasium, set up by Ephesian citizens and some freedmen. Actually, there's a freedman of Secundus that sets up one of these big bilingual bases, and they're bases for symplegma statues, which are entwined statues. So it's 2 figures. And so in this context, bilingualism is really interesting because they're also portraying and juxtaposing 2 languages in the same space. And they're also set up usually by pairs of individuals. So there's a deliberate duality to these spaces. The representation of writing here is absolutely beautiful. We have lovely Latin letters on top. And what you can also see is they've deliberately made it so that the Greek lines line up Caesar, Caesar, the Ephesian people, and the Quiritates, Maximilia and Maximilia, who is the wife of the benefactor. So there's an incredibly beautiful amount of control. And the one bit that is different actually uses spaces and stop marks to convey a slightly different message, which is in Greek, but it's the year of the Roman consul. So it's the bit that allows you to date the inscription, and it's only in Greek. And it shows a far more subtle, blended version of culture going on. So it's quite a different image of bilingualism. And finally, for this lovely bilingual inscription, when I first saw it, I actually didn't recognize that it was a bilingual inscription because it starts off in Latin, with this very Latin of the decree, but it's a decree of the Ephesian people in Latin. And then the section that talks about the city and the city's name, the first and greatest metropolis of Ephesus, is in Greek, as though that can't be translated or doesn't need to be translated into Latin. And then it comes down and lists the honorand, who is Sextus Sensius Proculus, an imperial figure and a Roman citizen. So what we get are far more blended version. This is the kind of mixed bilingual, where it's not two different texts, two different messages, but the language are actually thrown in together. And these we get around the mid-2nd century AD. So bilingualism has many different faces. And this isn't surprising in a way, because those changes are what draw attention. If they always looked the same and always had the same impact and image, it wouldn't represent the individual, but it also wouldn't attract attention in the same way. Now, similar issues come when we look at erasures. When we publish books on them, we tend to publish broad-ranging things. These are all the erasures in one place. And they tend to kind of focus on the commonalities between these inscriptions and commonalities between erasures, which are wonderful, but it leads into this perceptive expectation that we get from texts, where again, erasures are depicted in the same way within square brackets, and they can seem to look the same. They can seem to have the same visual framework and be represented the same in both languages. We can also lose the sensory the sensory kind of angle of it, which I've been trying to get this to work. It's probably not going to work, but I have a video of a carving on my phone, and if you ever hear it, it's loud, it's cacophonous. The idea that people weren't aware of what was going on if they couldn't read is also something. And the sound also triggers memories. So you kind of associate condemnation with this kind of loud, cacophonous process. So back to the inscription that we looked at for bilingualism. This also has erasures. And in fact, there are two other inscriptions that are just Greek that also have Gaius Asinius Gallus, who is the one of the officials' names in the inscription. And what you can see is in the Greek text, it's all perfectly erased and completely removed. But in the Latin texts, it's removed in different ways. So the one on one side, they've removed the whole name, but they've also, if you look in the drawing, the word leg on the line below, they've cut into it. And I honestly wonder if they did this first, because in the next inscription, the text that isn't really over that many words is erased, but the text that goes over other officials who weren't condemned name is not erased. And there are two factors in this. One, could he have done the first one, kind of made a mistake and said, I'm going to be more careful? And the other is the fact that if you look where these inscriptions were, erasing a text in situ is an incredibly difficult task. Normally, you kind of hit with the top down. So how do you do that when something is raised up? Even if you're in a ladder, that's a kind of precarious position. So there are lots of practical factors that are involved in erasures that we may not even think about. So there's also the fact that, so these are the two different erasures. So they can look different even within the same monument and have different outcomes even within the same monument. So Gaius Asinius Gallus, who was unfortunate enough to marry Tiberius' beloved wife Vipsania, was kind of exiled, and he starved to death in 33 AD. So nearly 40 years later, they're kind of erasing this. And then he's rehabilitated in 36 AD by Caligula. And in Rome, where his family is, his monuments are recarved. And you can see the smaller text here. But they're not in Ephesus. So this is not a consistent process that happens across an empire, but is very much dependent on context, visibility, and practical constraints. So for my next case study, I'm just got my eye on the time here. I'm gonna whiz through some of these. There are two main buildings. So the Emperor Domitian was a huge benefactor at Ephesus. Gave them neocore status. So this building on the right with the pretty pillars and the blue paints is a neocore's temple set up in his honor. The other is a giant fountain that was set up for Domitian because he also brought tons of aqueducts in. So what does this look like? So this is Domitian's fountain, and the inscriptions I'm going to show you, one is really high up here, and the other is probably down at the basin, just to give you the context that a viewer would have. This top text had actually initially been dedicated by Nero. So it was carved, and then they put bronze letters in the Domitianic inscription. So what happened when Domitian got condemned? Did they just take out Domitian, and then you saw the holes? And this was later then just reused. It was flipped over and reused again. It's one of these sad kind of erasures. At the bottom, we also have a dedication from the Demos of Ephesus dedicating the water coming into the fountain. And you can see Domitian's name has been erased, but they've only kind of lightly gone around the letters. And again, this could be practical constraints. You don't want to damage the text above or below, so you just lightly carve around the letters. The problem is, it's still very legible. There's no way someone doesn't know that this is Domitian's fountain. And the fact that he also had coins depicting himself and the river Marnas from the aqueduct also were still in circulation. But what's interesting is that down at the bottom, the second red bar, there's another erasure. And this erasure, they think, was connected with Olympian Games that were held in his honor in the same year that this was dedicated, in 92, 93. And again, if we look at this, this is a different type of erasure. Because they had all the blank space, they ticked away at it. And we actually don't know what this text said. We're going to need to get some RTI. So even on the same monument, we can have different types of erasures. These are statue bases from the Neocorus temple, and they, in a different context, because they were just dedicated to Domitian, they couldn't just erase the name because then they wouldn't be dedicated to anyone. So they had to rededicate the bases. And the one on the left is the one of the 13 bases that wasn't reinscribed, and the one on the right is one of 12 that were. But you can see with the reinscription, there's still a rough field. The text at the top is too big for the space, fitting Vespasian into the space of Germanicus. It's not a seamless transition. And again, it's a different image of erasure. With a different outcome. Finally, we have Trajan's Nymphaeum, and with this, this area down at the bottom where the guy is washing his hands, they reused a Domitianic inscription. And this one, I actually didn't notice at first that it had been erased because it's completely smoothed out at the bottom. So because this was reused, they didn't, and it was in a fountain for Trajan, they didn't want any association. So they did smooth over the text. And it might be that because it was moved, they then could take it to a workshop and do a better job. So there are all these different constraints in the statues. I want to answer questions, so I'm going to go through this super quick. This is just a series of statue bases that was set up in the Artemision. Lucilla married Lucius Verus in the Artemision in 164. And sometime between 175 and 180, all of these statues were set up of Marcus Aurelius, Faustina, and their 5 children. So initially, an awesome monument to family solidarity, right? But as time went on, various people were condemned, one was rehabilitated, but it ends up looking like quite a mess. And you don't need to be literate to see this weird version of kind of imperial whack-a-mole that is taking place. So when we look at the inscription, again, different types of erasures. You have a full erasure for Lucilla. Her face was chipped off statues in Smyrna. So that was a just complete, she didn't exist sort of thing. Commodus was reinscribed, but the letters are clearly smaller. And there's a relation to him kind of being a brother of Septimius Severus, and this is why they want that connection. Another daughter who is condemned later, if you look, is a partial erasure, and they only erased her name, but didn't erase Thugatera, her relationship to the family, the fact that she was a daughter. So very, very complex stuff going on here. And this is another erasure from the time of Geta, where even on the same text, the same line, I don't know if the carver got tired, but the first part is completely erased. And then the second part, you can still see bits of letters. Maybe one carver gave up and another less assiduous one took over. The fact is, these represent fundamentally different images of erasure as a process that even within the same inscription didn't necessarily look the same, and therefore may not be a universal process. And this is what this model really does, is allow us to look at things from a broader perspective, from a viewer, and from a bottom-up perspective. And when we think about the monumental landscape, it isn't just emperors. It isn't just a wealthy elite participating in the urban space, setting up monuments or engaging with them. And for me, this methodology is a way to kind of see what we don't see when we look at a published inscription. And last bit here, I've come up with a source book that's an alternative model that provides text, but also pictures, archaeological reconstructions, and a YouTube sensory video with like sounds that approaches the site. Because I think these are important, and I think they're ways to engage all viewers and students and scholars in a better way with inscriptions. So that is the end. Sorry, that was longer than I expected.